Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 749, and today is January 24th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show. This is probably going to be a long episode, so buckle in, and I want to get all this covered before the weekend. I didn't want to leave really anything hanging from Trump's first week in office, just because I really feel like the news cycle is going to pick up a little bit of speed under the Trump administration. We're certainly going to have a lot to cover here. So be sure you're subscribed to this show somewhere so you don't miss an episode. It is on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. Hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, and then follow me on Twitter for all my work, including all the articles I write. Probably put out about 10 of them or so this week. And of course, if you follow me on Twitter, you will find those just about as soon as I write them. Last thing, if you could, click on the link for the Kyle Anzalone Show. It's my brand new show. High quality show. I really like the product that we are putting out over at the Kyle Anzalone Show. So if you could subscribe to it, first of all, it would really help us out. We're trying to get the channel monetized, and so we need a few more subscribers and a few more watch hours to get that done. But again, I think you would really enjoy the product that we are putting out over at the Kyle Anzalone Show. We released another episode yesterday, so go watch that one. All right, now let's get into this episode, and we're starting off today with my Libertarian Institute debrief. This is an email that I send out to the Libertarian Institute list every day. Now, in that email, we, of course, talk about what's happening at the Institute, so in the news, podcast, and some of the featured articles. But I also write a little blurb about something I feel is really important going on, and today's is titled, Antony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of War. So I write, just days before Antony Blinken's 4-year run as America's top diplomat came to an end, the New York Times ran a headline that accurately summed up his tenure as Secretary of State. The headline, How Antony Blinken, America's top diplomat, became Secretary of War. The Times noted that while French President Emmanuel Macron proclaimed Blinken an eminent servant of peace, the secretary was recently confronted over his support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. In fact, as Blinken attempted to use his final weeks as Secretary of State to cement his image as a warrior for democracy, he was blasted several times for his unyielding support for Israel's war crimes in Gaza. Even at Blinken's final press conference, journalists Sam Husseini and Matt Blumenthal asked Blinken a series of questions about his support for Israel's genocide as they were removed from the press briefing room. Husseini's removal was dramatic. The journalists attempted to cling to the desk in front of him as several of Blinken's goons carried Husseini out of the room as he attempted to shout questions to the secretary. The image of a manhandled journalist drugged from the briefing room exposed Blinken as he was attempting to pose as a champion of press freedom. Blinken may be the worst Secretary of State in my lifetime, which is impressive considering the list includes Hillary Clinton, Condi Rice, Mike Pompeo, Colin Powell, and Madeleine Albright. Blinken spent 4 years occupying the position of America's top diplomat without once engaging in diplomacy. The Ukraine war could have been prevented, but he refused to talk to Russia. The genocide in Gaza could have been prevented, but he refused to talk to Israel. Reflecting on his time as Secretary of State, Blinken said to the Times, "If we want to use the term war expansively, I think the State Department has been yes, it has taken up a lot of our time and effort. And yes, as a part of that, you learn a lot about weapon systems." And so that's a pretty wild admission from Blinken that, yeah, he is the Secretary of War. That was his job as Secretary of State, and history will not judge him kindly for that. All right, next up here, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on January 22nd. You're fired. Trump dismisses Brian Hook in Truth Social post. So President Trump fired 4 presidential appointments that he said did not share his vision for America. Among those dismissed were Brian Hook, who served on the Trump transition team. Trump posted on Truth Social Monday, My presidential personnel office is actively in the process of identifying and removing over 1,000 presidential appointments from the previous administration who are not aligned with our vision to make America great again. Now, on this, I do think this is good. Now, I'm not sure who Trump is going to put in these positions. That they could be bad or even worse, right? It's not as if that I'm just saying, oh, I'm glad that Trump's firing them because I trust that Trump is going to put better appointments in place. I'm not saying that. I think it's good that Trump has identified that this is a problem, that he has to address these presidential appointments and he has to put somebody else in place, or he's going to, end up with people who are undermining his policy. So he continued in his post. Let this serve as official notice of dismissal for these 4 individuals, with many more coming soon. Jose Andres from the Presidential Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, Mark Milley from the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, Brian Hook from the Wilson Center for Scholars, and Keisha Lance Bottoms from the President's Export Council. You're fired. So in 2018, Hook joined the administration shortly before Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. Hook was tasked with implementing a maximum pressure sanctions campaign against Tehran and overthrowing the Iranian government. In 2020, Hook resigned from his post after he was unable to achieve either objective. Hook was a key official in helping to staff the incoming State Department on the transition team following Trump's second election victory. In November, Hook said the Trump administration would isolate Iran diplomatically and weaken them economically. Hook also attacked the Biden administration's policies of, quote, appeasement and accommodation with Iran, and he said it led to a failure of deterrence because no one believes you have a credible threat of military force. However, Biden increased sanctions on Iran, refused to enter into serious negotiations with Tehran, and actually aided Israel in tit-for-tat strikes between Tel Aviv and Tehran. Along with Hook, Chef Jose Andres was fired from the President's Council. Andres heads the World Food Kitchen, an international aid organization that often works with Washington. Last year, 7 WFK workers were killed by a series of Israeli strikes on their aid convoy in Gaza. While the White House did not punish or hold Tel Aviv accountable for the murder, Andres accepted a Presidential Medal of Freedom from Biden earlier this year, which seemed like a real insult to his 7 killed staffers. On the Hook firing, I do think this is a little bit of a mixed bag. So in one sense, you've already allowed Hook to staff the State Department. And so now you got Marco Rubio and I'm sure a bunch of other cretins that are going to be running around over there. So giving him that authority was a real mistake. Identifying that you need to fire him from the Wilson Center is a slight step in the right direction, but overall, Trump now has a whole bunch of Hook staffers in his administration. And so this isn't necessarily just great news on the Hook front, although it is that he did end up firing him here. All right. So now looking at least one person that Trump is putting into his administration that has some better views on foreign policy. This one from Dave DeCamp, January 22nd, antiwar.com. The Pentagon's new Middle East policy chief wants to scale down the U.S. presence in the region. So the Trump administration has appointed a new Middle East policy chief in the Pentagon who believes the U.S. should scale down its military presence in the region. Michael Domino, a former CIA analyst, was sworn in Monday as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Before taking the job, Domino was a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank that calls itself a hub of realism and restraint and advocates for a less interventionist foreign policy. And there are certainly articles from Defense Priorities or writers over at Defense Priorities that we have run at antiwar.com. I believe at one point Daniel Davis was over there, and there are several other people there that, even if, we don't always agree and we may have some differences, our viewpoints are going to be far closer together than their viewpoints with, say, a Marco Rubio or any kind of neoconservative. In other good news, Jewish Insider reported that Domino's appointment has alarmed pro-Israeli Republicans due to his views on the region. The report cited comments Domino made during a webinar last year where he said the Middle East does not really matter for U.S. interest. He explained vital or existential U.S. interests in the Middle East are as best characterized as minimal to non-existent. And I think if you look at America's experience as the primary security brokers for the region, it has not rendered any lasting political, economic, or security benefits in service of the U.S. interests or the American people. Domino has opposed attacking Iran's nuclear facilities and war with Iran in general, and has repeatedly called for the U.S. to withdraw troops from Iraq and Syria, citing their vulnerability to attack. When President Biden launched a bombing campaign of Yemen's Houthis in January 2024, Domino opposed it, suggesting that the U.S. consider putting pressure on Israel to improve conditions in Gaza, since the Israeli onslaught was the reason for the Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. So Domino wrote in Responsible Statecraft at the time, any multi-billion-dollar effort to fight a war with Yemen would render no political, economic, or security benefits to the United States. Strategies like buck passing and diplomatic engagement are perfectly viable, would do the U.S. no harm, and could resolve the crisis. Continued military action in Yemen, by contrast, presents dubious prospects for success. And look, this is a situation somewhat like Syria, where even if the U.S. does have success in running the Houthis out of Sana'a, like they ran Assad out of Damascus, then what? It seems in Yemen, and this is because of the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE's war in Yemen for 8 years, that the, kind of strongest fighting force and the forces that are opposed to the Houthis are comprised of, if not the remnants, directly the, fighters from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, one of the, Al-Qaeda groups most concerned with waging attacks inside of the United States of America. All right. So in other Trump news here, Pentagon deploys 1,500 troops to the southern border. The acting Secretary of Defense ordered 1,500 Marines and soldiers to the southern border to help enforce U.S. immigration law. President Donald Trump has made curbing the flow of migrants entering the U.S. a top priority. The new administration is considering increasing the deployment to 10,000 troops. So on Wednesday, acting Secretary of Defense, that is Robert Salas, ordered 500 Marines and 1,000 soldiers from the Army to the border. Initially, the troops will be limited to roles assisting border enforcement agents, including conducting deportation flights, helicopter patrols over the southern border, and constructing barriers. Salas said the goal is complete operational control of the southern border. Under the Posse Comitatus Act, the president cannot order troops to enforce laws on U.S. soil. Presidents have frequently deployed troops to the border to aid immigration enforcement. However, Trump is considering invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act, which would allow the president to order troops to engage in law enforcement on U.S. soil. ACLU told Axios the organization was preparing to take action if the administration moved forward with using American troops to enforce law in the U.S. Salas said 1,500 troops could be the beginning of a larger deployment. This is just the beginning, he said. In short order, the deployment will develop and execute additional missions in cooperation with DHS, federal agencies, and state partners to address the full range of threats outlined by the president at our nation's border. CBS News reported the deployment could swell to as many as 10,000 soldiers. A senior defense official said the deployment could evolve to include more aerial surveillance. They said, we also anticipate that there would be some additional airborne intelligence, surveillance, and support assets that would move down to the border to increase situational awareness. The White House said stronger immigration and border enforcement was a top focus of the administration. So the White House press secretary explained, this is something President Trump campaigned on. The American people have been waiting for such a time as this for our Department of Defense to actually implement Homeland Security seriously. This is a number one priority for the American people. And so, leaving aside kind of the debate on immigration and whether or not, getting the border under control, preventing migrants from entering the United States should or should not be a top priority of the White House, there is, I think, a libertarian concern here when it comes to having U.S. troops enforce law on U.S. soil. Understand that a lot of people identify what is going on at the southern border as an invasion. However, it's, far more complicated than to just pretend that we're putting these 1,500 soldiers to stand somewhere along the border to make sure that nobody crosses through. That if we start allowing them to enforce laws in the United States, then, we could see deployments of U.S. soldiers on American streets, something that I would find fairly horrifying. All right. Next up here, this one is NATO chief says alliance must step up support for Ukraine. So NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that NATO members must increase support for Ukraine and change the trajectory of the war. He asserted that spending more now will save trillions of dollars that will need to be spent if Ukraine lost the war. So speaking on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos on Thursday, Rutte argued Western states must, quote, step up and not scale back the support they are sending to Kiev, adding, we have to change the trajectory of this war. Rutte's statement is an admission that the war has not been going well for Kiev over the past several months. Ukrainian forces have consistently lost territory to Russian troops. Additionally, Kiev has struggled to find enough young men to stabilize the front lines. While Rutte believes that escalating support to Kiev will lead to Ukraine's victory, many analysts argue that Russia maintains escalation dominance over a smaller neighbor. This was the prevailing view of the Obama administration. President Obama explained in 2016 that Ukraine is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what support Washington provides to Kiev. And so, stepping up support for Ukraine isn't going to lead to Ukraine winning this war. It's just going to lead to more death and destruction in Ukraine. And sure, a part of that does mean that Russia is going to spend more money. There's going to be more dead Russian troops, more destroyed Russian military equipment in Ukraine. But there's a couple important factors here. One, the Ukrainians are feeding the meat grinder at a far more rapid pace than the Russians are. And so how many Ukrainians does it take to kill a Russian soldier, and is it worth it to weaken Russia in that way? I really think it's not. And then also, just larger bombs are going to be used. Ukrainian cities are going to be destroyed. Russia will prevail in this conflict, right? It might take longer. The West may be able to drag this war out for years and years and years. And during that time, kill Russia and weaken Russia and impoverish Russia and, cause Russia problems for years to come. These young men who are going to be traumatized, brutalized, physically, mentally maimed and injured by this war. Sure, like all these negative things that happened during the U.S. war on terrorism, I'm sure Russia is going to suffer those same consequences down the road. And so there is a sense for the longer this war goes on, that the worse it's going to be for Russia. The problem here, of course, is that it's 10 times worse for Ukraine, right? Or whatever the factor is, it's multiple times worse for Ukraine than it will be for Russia. And so for all we talk about of weakening Russia, we're weakening Ukraine even more. And so we put in enough weapons and suddenly Ukraine is able to flip the script and win the war. That's not a potential outcome of this conflict. Still, Rutte asserted in his WEF statement that increasing aid to Ukraine now will save the West money over the long term. He said if Ukraine loses, then to return deterrence of the rest of NATO again, it will be much, much higher price than what we are contemplating at this moment in terms of ramping up our spending and ramping up our industrial production. So Rutte and other Western leaders argued that after President Putin conquers Ukraine, he will invade other European nations. Putin has explained that Moscow views Kiev's membership in NATO as a threat to Russia's national security, and that the war in Ukraine is only intended to prevent Kiev's ascension into the Washington-led bloc. The NATO chief claimed that if Russia prevailed in Ukraine, it could embolden other countries to invade their neighbors. He said, "This is not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine or Russia and Europe. It's a geopolitical issue because of North Korea, China, Iran, and that's why we need to get a good deal. A good deal means you won't have Putin high-fiving with Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping and the mullahs in Iran." Interestingly enough here, though, Rutte did not mention Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, unlike the other countries, actually ordered the invasion of two of his neighboring countries last year, Syria and Lebanon. So, it's all just a joke and rhetoric. It's not really about, they're worried that Putin's going to high five with Kim Jong-un and then Kim Jong-un is going to invade South Korea. That's not what they're actually worried about here. Because if they're worried about countries just seizing territory of other countries, they wouldn't be backing Israel. They would, pull all funding from Israel, and Netanyahu would be in the same category as Vladimir Putin of, international pariah in the views, in the eyes of NATO. So at the event, Trump envoy Rick Grenell criticized NATO members for failing to meet alliance standards on military spending and attacked the policy of former President Joe Biden. He said, "You should be able to talk to people. Talking is a tactic, and you're not going to be able to solve problems peacefully unless you actually have conversations." And, we already talked about Blinken refusing to talk to people at the top of the show, but just to review that, the Biden administration's policy was essentially, we're not going to engage in negotiations with anybody. You have our terms, which are, the complete Russian withdrawal from Ukraine and including Crimea. And that's, if you don't do that, we're not going to talk. And those kind of maximalist demands don't lead to any kind of diplomacy whatsoever, and leads to conflicts dragging on for decades and decades and decades. So Rutte agreed with Grenell that NATO members need to increase their defense spending. He also voiced support for Trump's threat to impose tariffs and sanctions on Russia. He said, "That is the way forward. Trump starting the debate, that debate is good. He will always do it in his own way." On Wednesday, Trump threatened to ramp up the economic war on Russia if a deal between Kiev and Moscow was not reached soon. He said, "If we don't make a deal, and soon, I will have no choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries." On Thursday, the Kremlin responded by downplaying the threat of more sanctions and repeated Moscow is prepared to engage with the U.S. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, told reporters, "We do not see any particularly new elements here. He likes these methods, at least he liked them during his first presidency. We carefully recorded all the nuances. We remain ready for dialogue. President Putin has repeatedly spoken about this, for equal dialogue, for mutual respectful dialogue." So I thought the Russian response there was good, kind of keeping the door open and downplaying any potential negatives. All right, so a few more stories here on Ukraine. Zelensky says U.S. troops must be deployed to Ukraine for a peace deal. This one from Dave DeCamp, January 22nd, antiwar.com. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that U.S. troops must be included in a Western peacekeeping force that he wants to deploy to Ukraine as a potential peace deal with Russia. Speaking at the WEF, Zelensky called for 200,000 European troops to be sent to Ukraine to uphold the peace deal, an idea that is a non-starter for talks with Moscow. He said, "We need contingencies with very strong numbers of soldiers. From Europeans, 200,000. It's a minimum, otherwise it's nothing." I don't know where Zelensky came up with this, why he thought saying this would help anything. The only logical kind of thinking here is that Zelensky is making this demand, understanding that citizens in the West are going to be, appalled by it, that they don't want 200,000, certainly not that many of their soldiers being deployed to Ukraine, even if it is in a peacekeeping force. And maybe he thinks if he, makes these absurd demands, they'll say, sending weapons is a hell of a lot cheaper than that. But this is never going to happen. And if it did, it would cause a direct war between NATO and Russia. So in an interview with Bloomberg following the remarks, Zelensky said U.S. troops needed to be involved or the Europeans wouldn't want to be involved. He explained, "It can't be without the United States. Even if some European friends think it can be, no, it can't be. Nobody will risk without the United States." The Wall Street Journal reported in December that President Trump wanted European troops to deploy to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire. But the idea was quickly dismissed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said Moscow was certainly not satisfied with that proposal. One of Russia's primary motivations for launching the invasion of Ukraine was the country's alignment with NATO, and Ukrainian neutrality is a key Russian demand for peace, meaning Russia won't settle for an agreement that involves a major Western troop presence in Ukraine. Now, also want to mention here that Trump mentioned working with Russia and China on denuclearization. So on Thursday, President Trump delivered a virtual address to the WEF and said he wanted to discuss denuclearization with Russia and China. So in a way, I think this is a good thing. That this does seem to be something that Trump really does care about. Not like a top priority, but something that he brings up time and time again, which is there's a real need for denuclearization. Couldn't agree with him more on that issue. However, he doesn't either seem to understand or either, just thinks this is all negotiating tactics, and I don't think has a real practical proposal here. Because during his first administration, the U.S. and Russia particularly, but overall, Trump went really the wrong way on denuclearization. So he got out of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty with Russia, which of course, increased tensions. He also almost killed the New START Treaty. It was just Joe Biden taking office and putting it at the top of his agenda and negotiating and extending the New START Treaty from 2021 until 2026. But prior to that, Trump was all but refusing to negotiate on the New START Treaty. So that agreement, that is the only remaining nuclear forces control agreement between the U.S. and Russia, nearly died because of Donald Trump. And the problem is that Trump says, I don't want to make a bilateral nuclear deal with Russia. It has to involve China, which, okay, China has a nuclear triad. Certainly, there are ways to discuss and maybe bring China into some kind of nuclear arms control agreement. However, the U.S. and Russia have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And so it's very unlikely that China is going to want to really enter into any bilateral pact with the United States and Russia. And it's probably important to just negotiate those bilateral and extend those bilateral pacts first, and then maybe start to look at bringing China, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, some of these other nuclear, the UK and France, into the negotiations on nuclear weapons control, and maybe say like, okay, the US and Russia will get rid of 5% of our nuclear weapons if China does so as well. And so for the US, that might be about 500 nuclear weapons. For China, that's going to mean like 15, 20, 30, 40 nuclear weapons, right? But, maybe that's the way that we get this kind of ratcheting down in nuclear weapons with countries that have vastly different sized nuclear stockpiles. It doesn't really make sense for China to agree, okay, Russia, China, and the US are all going to destroy 100 nuclear weapons. That might be 20, 30% of China's nuclear stockpile, and a completely inconsequential amount to the United States or Russia. So, I don't think Trump is really going in with any kind of practical plan here, just kind of based more on his first administration and what we saw there. All right, next up here, Taiwan publicizes the U.S. sending troops for a 2-year naval training program. So last week, the Taiwanese Defense Ministry announced it signed a deal with the U.S. under which the U.S. will send military personnel for the island for a naval training program. The U.S. has a history of sending personnel to train Taiwanese forces, but the training programs are typically not publicized for fear of provoking China. A source told the Taipei Times that the announcement marked the first time Taipei had officially announced a specialized training program with the U.S. The Taipei Times report said that the U.S. was changing its low-key and confidential training approach to a semi-public approach, testing political and public reactions. So, look, they're testing, and they're being public about that, they're testing the political and public reactions, then China is going to look at this and rightfully say, if we don't have a major reaction, the United States is going to think that we don't care and that we're fine with this. And so I think this is going to invoke a fairly major reaction from Beijing in the coming weeks. I don't know what that's going to be. I don't think that they're going to invade or attack Taiwan. It'll be in the line of military drills or something like that. But it's certainly something that gets the Trump and Xi relationship off on a very bad start. So Taiwan's last president, Tsai Ing-wen, was the first to confirm the presence of U.S. troops on the island since Washington and Taipei severed relations in 1979, an acknowledgement that she made in 2021. Last year, Taiwan confirmed that U.S. Green Berets had been deployed to Kinmen Country, a group of small islands that are just a few miles off the main coast of mainland China. The U.S. naval training deal signed between Taiwan's Navy and the U.S.'s de facto embassy in Taiwan is worth $1.5 million, and the training program is expected to last until the end of 2026. Details of the training program are unclear, but the Taipei Times said it will likely involve amphibious combat training. The Biden administration significantly increased U.S. support for Taiwan, including by providing U.S.-funded military aid for the first time, steps that China has warned strongly against. The U.S. military is openly planning for a future war with China over Taiwan, despite the risk of that war turning nuclear. The Trump administration is expected to continue the hardline policy on China and nominated China hots to fill key cabinet roles, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio. In a signal to China, Rubio's first meeting after being sworn in was with diplomats from Quad countries, which the U.S. views as a potential foundation for a NATO-style alliance in Asia, which, would be directed at China. All right, next up here, we are switching over to the Middle East. Shin Bet says Israel's multi-front war is now focused on the West Bank. So the head of the Israeli Shin Bet security agency said Thursday that Israel's multi-front war is now focused on the occupied West Bank amid a new Israeli siege of the northern Palestinian city of Jenin. So the Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar said that we are in a multi-front war, and it's now the turn of Samaria. And Samaria, Judea and Samaria are what Israel calls the West Bank. I think Judea is like the southern portion and Samaria is the northern portion of the West Bank. And so, this is when the Israelis use this term, it's, saying that this is ours, right? Like the West Bank is not the future Palestinian state. We get to name it. It's ours, right? That's the thinking here. So Barr made the comments while visiting Israeli troops with Lieutenant General Herzi Halvali, the head of the Israeli military, who said Israeli forces must be ready for continuous operations in the Jenin refugee camp to handle pressure and at the same time know how to do other things as well. At least 12 Palestinians have been killed in Jenin since Israel launched its renewed assault on the city on Tuesday. Resistance groups said they engaged with the invading Israeli troops, but so far there has not been word on Israeli casualties. Jenin's deputy governor, Mansour al-Saadi, said Thursday that Israeli forces had blocked all 4 entrances to the city and its refugee camp. Israeli military bulldozers have been tearing up roads in Jenin, and hundreds of Palestinians in the refugee camp have been forced to flee their homes. The deputy governor warned the attack could be a repetition of what happened in the northern Gaza Strip, a systematic campaign of extermination. Israel Defense Minister Israel Katz has said that Israel is applying the lessons it learned in Gaza to its assault on the West Bank. The Israeli military launched its assault on Jenin just 2 days after the Gaza ceasefire took effect. The attack also came after the Palestinian Authority was conducting major operations in Jenin as a part of a crackdown on resistance groups. The PA withdrew when Israel began its invasion, but there are reports that PA forces have been involved in the Israeli attack on the city. According to the Cradle, the PA killed a resistance fighter in Jenin on Wednesday night. So things are continuing to ratchet up in the West Bank. Now, when it comes to Gaza, Trump envoy says it's good Hamas wants talks with the U.S. So Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, said Wednesday that it was good that Hamas was open to talks with the U.S. He was asked in an interview with Fox News about comments from Mustafa Abu Mazarak, a Hamas official based in Qatar, who said, "We are prepared for dialogue with America and achieving understanding on everything." In response, Witkoff said, "Well, I think it's good if it's accurate. I think we're able to demonstrate that President Trump's policies, peace through strength, they work, everybody listens." Witkoff's presence on the pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was seen as a key factor in getting Israel to agree to the hostage and ceasefire deal, but it's unclear if the agreement will hold, as Israeli officials are threatening to restart military operations after the first phase. President Trump said Monday that he was not confident that the ceasefire would hold. When asked about those comments, Witkoff acknowledged the implementation of the deal would be more difficult than the execution. So Witkoff said that he would be traveling to the region, including areas of Gaza controlled by the Israeli military, to monitor the ceasefire. He said, "I'm actually going to be going over to Israel. I'm going to be a part of the inspection team at the Nazarene corridor and also in the Philadelphia corridor." So Witkoff, a real estate investor from New York, also said normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states were the key to a peace in the region, although similar deals did nothing to resolve the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. And so during the first Trump administration, we had the Abraham Accords, which Trump, claims are a peace deal. They really weren't. And in fact, they, in a lot of ways, I think, made the situation in the Middle East worse. So if Trump thinks he's going to solve things by expanding the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia and Egypt, he may be severely mistaken on the results of those agreements. All right. This one, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. U.S. private security contractors to operate checkpoint in Gaza. Armed U.S. security contractors will begin operating a checkpoint in Gaza in the coming days, Axios reported on Thursday. The report said the U.S. contractors will be deployed to Gaza as a part of a multinational group that's been established by the Gaza ceasefire deal and is backed by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt. Initially, the deployment will involve 2 private American companies, Safe Reach Solutions and UG Solutions, which employ U.S. military veterans. A third company is an Egyptian firm that's backed by Egyptian intelligence. The contractors will operate a checkpoint at the Nazarene corridor, a strip of land south of Gaza City, where the Israeli military has demolished nearly every building in sight and established a military base. As a part of the hostage deal, Hamas wanted Palestinians forcibly displaced from northern Gaza to be able to pass freely through the corridor. Israel demanded that its forces must inspect every Palestinian that passes through, and the compromise was for private security firms to be involved. A source told Axios that the purpose of the contractor to deployment was to ensure that orderly vehicle movement while preventing the transport of weapons northward in line with the ceasefire terms. So in recent months, the Israeli military has worked to completely destroy the northern Gaza cities of Bet Lahia, Bet Hanun, and Jabalia as a part of its ethnic cleansing campaign known as the General's Plan. Elements of the Israeli government want the campaign to lead to the establishment of Jewish settlements and likely strongly oppose the return to the Palestinians to the northern Gaza area. The contractors are expected to only be in Gaza until the end of the first phase of the ceasefire deal, which involves a 42-day truce. Israeli officials are threatening to restart its genocidal war after the first phase of the deal ends. Now, on to the rest of the Middle East. Trump put Steve Witkoff in charge of Iran negotiations. So this, on its face, seems like a good deal just based off of what happened in Gaza. It may not work out. We really have to see on this. I'm not sure how Witkoff is going to handle this. The only reason I'm somewhat optimistic is because he did show some willingness to put some pressure on the Israelis, which will likely be required to achieve any deal. Now, when it comes to Lebanon, Israel wants to extend its troops stay in Lebanon past the initial 60-day ceasefire during which Israel was supposed to withdraw. It was really a truce. Israel was supposed to withdraw from Lebanon during those 60 days. In that time, they've only claimed more territory, so it seems likely that they will be staying at least an additional 30 days. And then this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Trump redesignates Yemen's Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This is something that Trump did at the very, very end of his first administration. And so it really didn't have a major impact because Biden undid it fairly quickly. However, designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization will ensure that any final peace deal between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia from their war that has been in a peace since 2022 can finally come to an official end. If that war restarts, of course, the United States will find itself once again allied with the Al-Qaeda forces in the region. So hopefully something gets worked out here, that this is some kind of bluff. But my concern is that Trump is very serious and that this FTO designation will exist on the Houthis for the next 4 years. So who knows what's going to come from that. This also comes during the same week. So Trump negotiated the ceasefire deal and the Houthis stopped conducting attacks against shipping in the Red Sea and actually released the crew members of a ship that they had seized last year. And so at a time when the Houthis are actively de-escalating, this is significantly ratcheting up tensions, and I think a very big mistake for Donald Trump. All right, everybody, that will do it for the show today. It was a busy first week of the Trump administration. I hope you enjoyed our coverage here on conflicts of interest and that you also tuned in over at the Kyle Anzalone Show for my coverage of some of Trump's early statements and decisions, executive actions, lots of things that Trump is doing here in the first week of his administration. I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon, so at least we will have a lot of interesting news to cover here, even if it's bad. Subscribe if you can, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you all next week.